I'm going to do a special little one-off presentation to give you an impression. This isn't so much to give you a full understanding, but rather just to give you an overview of the fundamental issues, because the more I'm learning about the natural world, the more inadequate the whole theory of evolution has become. It's become an anemic explanatory system. I love this guy here. He's just kind of looking at here as pointing this orangutan's pointing to this evolution. But the idea, what we're looking here is really at not so much whether you're young Earth or not. It's not the real issue. Not all evangelicals agree on the how, but we do agree on the who. And mere creationism then asserts that it's top down, not bottom up. It's not some kind of a reductionism where it's just the smaller things creating the larger. Let me explain what I mean by that as we just kind of move forward. So the basic notion then of where it comes from, whether there's an intelligent design, and I always claim that inference to the best explanation is always your best way of doing science. You look at the possibilities and you say, could this have been designed? Or if it was not. So the whole idea of evolution, though, is to get rid of the knowledge that things look like they're designed, but to convince them they're not. So this is a kind of a workaround. And there's a non-theistic evolutionary model, effectively, that tells us these basic things. The fundamental principle is that non-living systems generated life by means of time and chance. That's the basic idea, as you know. Non-living so non-life produced life. Microevolution is, which is small changes, leads to macroevolution, which is large changes. So that in the microevolution, you'd have no problem for this lizard to actually there'd be various forms and varieties. We're all well aware of that. But the macro is a much more ambitious project that claims that eventually it led into higher forms and eventually perhaps becomes a bird, you see. And when you move in that direction, then you don't really have the actual transitional links. Darwin claimed that, I know the transitions aren't there yet, but we'll find them eventually in the geological record. Well, actually, since his time, the more we discover, the more the geological record does not support it. In fact, it shows vast gaps of transitionals. They're not there. And so you don't have these connections according to this system at all. The Cambrian explosion alone, all the phyla suddenly appear with no predecessors. And then the real philosophical question, and this is a very fundamental thing, and it illustrates that sometimes scientists don't make the best philosophers because essentially what you're looking at here is the effects can never be greater than the cause. Are you aware of any effect that's greater than the cause? Have you ever heard of such a thing? If this is what it's claiming, here's what I mean. It's claiming that the effects which we observe in this world of complexity, another effect is life itself. How did life appear? That intelligence, we observe that as well, and we also observe personality. Now these are profound effects, but they're claiming here that the causes are in fact disorder, that they are non-life, that they are random mutations, and that there's impersonal events. In other words, disorder produces order, non-life produces life, randomness produces intelligence, and impersonality produces personality. Let's revisit that, because it's totally inadequate. It's a system that does not work. It fails, just even logically. No effects are going to be greater than the causes. You see, so this is a flawed system in that respect as well. And then there are a number of scientific problems with the whole idea of non-theistic evolution. Lots of them, and no workable mechanism that can account for the first living cell. In fact, I don't even need to talk about evolution. You can't get to life. You just cannot get to life. You can't even make a protein, let alone DNA, let alone the cell itself. You just can't do it. And the more we learn about this, the guy to look up is James Tour from Rice University. He's got so many videos on this now, and he is a synthetic chemist, and he builds these robotic little systems, these nanobots. He knows what it takes to build these things up. And he says that it cannot work, and there's good reasons for it. There's no workable mechanism for getting, we don't understand how to do it, nor can we account for highly complex living systems like the human brain. It just does not work at all. So the more we look at this, and the assumption is that really that somehow, well, in my field, it doesn't seem to be true, but other fields say a claim, but then they all say the same thing. It doesn't work, and the system's becoming more and more anemic, and it's becoming obvious. Chemical production, for example, for a first living cell would require a statistical miracle. It really would. Random atoms would have to be formed into amino acids. And people gush about the Miller-Urey experiment that took place where they were actually able to synthesize amino acids back in the 50s. They haven't gone anywhere since then. In fact, it's shown they can't really, and even their system didn't work effectively because it didn't produce the order you needed. Because you see, it's not only having amino acids, but these must link together to form chains. And there are 20 basic amino acids that all proteins consist of. And your body is filled with these, but they have to actually have chains, what are called polypeptides or peptide bonds. Again, I'm giving you an impression. You don't need to learn this, get an impression, get a sense. But the science is there. The polypeptide chains have to become really long, and they have to form a precisely ordered sequence of these 20 amino acids you see. There's a very, very real sequence that's involved. And then having done that, you've got to create even more complex proteins after that. And then very long and highly ordered molecular change, DNA and RNA, have to be formed. And then an enormously complex chemical factory has to be produced to order all this together. And so it becomes incredibly difficult as we go on further and further. And we look at the structures of these things. We look at a protein, for example. And if you look at a protein, this is the primary structure. So these little balls are really supposed to be DNA, amino acids. There are 20 types, and they form these chains together, and it's all variations. But the interesting thing is they have to form long chains, which is problematic in the first place. And the chains, it's not random. Those have to be in an alphabet. They have to mean something. There has to be a sequence that's coherent in meaning. It's not just linking them together. They have to have an actual structural integrity and meaning. And that's the first level. The next level, it turns out, that the protein then produces a secondary structure where it produces a helix. Nobody understands how it forms this. We cannot produce that ourselves. We cannot develop a protein on our own in a laboratory. Furthermore, then it produces a third level of structure. You see a tertiary structure. It gets even more amazing. Folded individual peptides and so forth. And nobody understands how it happens, but new information appears in the geometry, the three-dimensional geometry. And then look at this. This is a fourth level. So there's 4 layers of structures, and it gets exquisitely complex to have these aggregations of various peptides to produce these incredible complex models. We can't we don't know how to fold them. We don't know how it works. 4 levels deep. And so the problems just get even more and more rich. It's the complexity of a factory is what we're looking at when we're considering a cell. Our technology has delved into the tiniest particles of life, and it's revealed that the cell is the most complex system that humanity has ever confronted. When in Darwin's day, he thought it was kind of like blobs blobs of various materials and so forth, and it was just not that complicated, and that you could eventually put, like Lego blocks, just something very basic. Turns out that these Lego blocks, each one of these cells is as complex as a whole body in its own way. It is beyond comprehension, because we know it now contains power stations that have to produce the energy that's used by the cell. And there's factories within every cell of every one of your 40 trillion cells has factories within it, you see. And it has these factories that manufacture enzymes and hormones essential for life. It's a data bank where all the necessary information about all the products to be produced has to be recorded. And then there are complex transportation systems and pipelines for carrying raw materials and products. They create nano chains, you see. So they have actually these little chains of connections, as you'll see, where one thing leads to another, and then it breaks them apart. So these nanopathways are constantly being doing specialized membranes, and it goes beyond imagination. It's storing information storing systems, conveyor systems, compartments where chemical processes are made, and energy-generating power stations and packaging centers. And so it becomes incredible. In fact, just to give you a bit of an illustration of what this is like, if I were to look at, for example, something like the DNA wrapping here, and just give you, we've looked at this before, I've shown you this little thing, but if you look at the DNA, and it alone is exquisitely complex, as you can imagine. This double helix, and then it's wrapped into itself with histones. They come together, and it wraps it into these other molecules called loops. These loops, and these loops then get tighter and tighter until they form a new form. You see, like this chain. And if that wasn't enough, it just continues. And then that itself is grouped together into yet another level of organization. And nobody understands how that works, but it all produces these marvelous wonders that we describe as, and we see the replication of the DNA itself. We can see how the DNA actually works and it copies in the cells. And it's a factory again. We're looking at an assembly line of biochemical machines. They're pulling apart the DNA double helix. They have to go in there and unravel. It's 3 levels of order. So it's the DNA, and then it's wrapped within itself, and then a 3rd level of wrapping. It's coils within coils within coils. You know why? Because every strand of DNA in your body, in each of the cells, is 6 feet long. So that's 3.2 billion nucleotide pairs. That teases out to be 6 feet long. How do they compress it into this incredibly tiny area? And then how does it know where to do? And it opens it up and then finds a place and copies it backwards, and then it folds it back up again, and then brings it out of the interior of the cell and brings it into the cytoplasm, and then it brings us to a place that manufactures this thing. And indeed, it's actually spins the DNA as fast as a jet engine, as it's actually replicating and putting these things together. So I just love these themes here that you can see, these molecular machines. Another way of looking at it here is, again, you have these, let me just see, so you have a backbone here, and the ATGC, which are the various nucleotides, and then it whips together and forms these marvels and wonders within the cell. But another best images we can do is this one, as far as trying to get a sense of what's involved in this cell. So these are just simplistic or overviews of what's inside your cell. And you just look at this thing. It is beyond imagination. These are just ways of it's a whole, it has little lipid rafts. You don't know you have such an amazing body. And you have all these little components here that work together in ways that are beyond imagination. And it just continues and on. And so I'm impressed with the fact that we've been able to figure this much out. But I'm really impressed with the one who made it. Because it's given us the mind to be able to do it, but it just goes on, and you can see these incredible microtubules which are used to transport it. And then this little thing walks along here, and it actually, these motor proteins have like little feet that walk along like that. And it goes on, and it brings it to the mitochondria and all these wonderful components. And so your whole cell is like a wonderful, mysterious thing that is almost like an alien world. You see, it's just beyond our imagination. We can't even begin to get a grip on what's involved in that. So it is indeed more than a factory. As factories, doesn't do justice to it, to give you a real sense of what it's like. Well, the idea that they always appeal to, though, give me enough time and even the most improbable things will happen. Isn't that the argument you've always heard? Basically, give me enough time and even the most unusual things. This sounds reasonable. But what happens when you put numbers to it? It's always interesting. So, for example, George Bernard Shaw said, give me 1,000,000 monkeys over 1,000,000 years and they'll be able to write out Shakespeare's Tempest. Just give me enough time, give me enough monkeys and so forth. So that's a fun project to consider. So I did this with a friend. And what we had here is, if we make it really simple, here's the rules of engagement here. Assume 1,000,000 monkeys, okay? They're typing 24 hours a day. I don't know, I guess they're having bananas and peanut butter fed to them, but they're constantly working 24 hours a day. And you work it out where they're typing at a rate of 100 words a minute on typewriters that have 40 keys. So you can get very specific about the actual parameters that are involved. You can determine just by probability how long it would require. So the first one, so I'm going to make it really easy too. Each of the play of Shakespeare that we're going to use will always have 4-letter words only. Make it really easy, you see. So just what does it take to get the first word, which was 4 letters? Well, in that process then, we know exactly what it would take. It would take approximately, to get the first word, about 12 seconds to get the first word. So you might have time, the word time, and it would take 12 seconds to get in that sequence. Now you want a second word, which is to have 8 in a sequence, okay? And to do that, it would take about 5 days, okay? So because the probability, the higher you go, the worse it gets. How long would it take for them to get, for 3 words? That's now you have 12 words in a row, 12 letters in a row. 4 words, 3 4-letter words, 100 years. Now, here's the fun. What do you think it would take for them to get 16 letters in a row? And again, in the sequence, and you don't have to worry about even the spaces between the words. Just have the words, the letters themselves in a sequence. What would you give me a guess to get the 4th one? Give me a guess. Be generous. Be generous. 25,000. Do I hear more? Do I hear more? Hurrah! Come on. Huh? 1,000,000 years. Do I hear more? 1,000,000 years. Do I hear more? I'm going to go to this. 100 billion years. 100, that's longer than astronomers estimate by far the age of the universe. 100 billion years. To get 5 in a word, forget a sentence, forget a play, forget an act. You can't even get a sentence, you see. So we're saying the next one, 5 letters in the word, would be in the realm of in the trillions of years, and then you just keep on going up with the probability. So when you put numbers to it, it doesn't look so probable that it does it anymore, and that's the exact the nature of this. And then we have the primordial soup theory as well. So beginning with the first step, many evolutionists assume some kind of a primordial earthly atmosphere with no oxygen, so the amino acids could be formed. The problem is when there's no oxygen, then once you get it, the ultraviolet light will kill them. So then they have to figure out some way to protect them. So the systems don't work very well at all. And there's lots of problems with this theory. It's like Campbell's primordial soup, you see. They talk about this primordial soup, you see. And so give me mixed soup with 1 ocean water, radiation, heat uncovered in microwavable ocean on high, about 100 million years. Carefully leave an ocean for 3 billion years, allowing oxygen to accumulate, heat circulating occasionally. I mean, it's just not going to work, you see. And so ultimately then, a simple self-organizing meal with everything you need to get your life started with before the Archean passes by. So it's very clever, but you see, you can't get this primordial soup. So even in the most ideal conditions, even with generous assumptions that you made, how long would it take for you to get these, remember these amino acid bonds together? To get two of these amino acids bound together, in the most perfect situations, the probability would be 1 in 100 because they're hard to bind together. They don't actually do it. To get 3 in together would be 1 in 10,000, a tripeptide. And to get a polypeptide of only 10 amino acids, it would take 100 quintillion, 1 in 100 quintillion. It's not looking good, is it? And you need a lot more than 10 amino acids. Typical protein will have actually about 400 of these. And here's another problem. Did I tell you that they come in left hands and right hands? And actually, your body, all living systems, whether plants or animals, all their proteins always consist of left-handed amino acids, all of them. If there's one right-handed amino acid, it would keep the thing from working. Now, this is a very fascinating thing. Why that way? One right-handed amino acid would destroy the entire chain, even though they can bond together, but they won't work in living systems. Yeah. Left-handed means this. It's just like they're optical isomers. You see, they actually mirror images of one another, but just as one, they're not the same, but they are the same. They're mirror images, you see. And they can bind together. But see, how did it come to pass that you would have all left-handed amino acids? Somewhere this had to start. So you work that out then, and you have a problem here because you'd have to, a typical protein, 400 left-handed amino acids, you'd have to work on this. And so it's like flipping a coin, a fair coin, 400 times in a row and getting heads every time. You begin to get very suspicious, don't you, after a while? Because the problem that you have is they can link together, and they've evoked all kinds of things like natural selection. No, that's cheating because it's not alive yet. So you can't appeal to natural selection. So you can't even get evolution because the thing's not even alive. Natural selection won't work. Your probabilities are exquisitely low. About one chance in 10 to the 120. Now we're talking about 120 zeros after that one. Again, it's so impossible that it's inconceivable to imagine what it would take. It would be, this accounts for the fact that 20 kinds of amino acids, they operate like letters in the alphabet. So 3 things you've got, they all have to be in the exact right order, they all have to be left-handed, and they all have to be bonded together in highly complex chains that actually don't ordinarily match together. And in fact, the breakdown rate would exceed the buildup rate. So time is not your friend. Because the more time you have, the more likely it will break down. So when it comes to building kinetic systems, as Tor said, time is not your friend, it's your enemy. So time is not going to be the solution to the problem again. Again, I'm only trying to give you an impression. And then to go the next level up from the proteins, which are impossible for us to create, we have the DNA, which is impossible. So what you now have, again, very alphabetical, very, very much like a language, and that's what exactly it is. So when you're looking at the language of DNA, you have these genes that have instructions for making proteins. And these letters consist of a 4-letter alphabet, you see. The T is thymine, and then the A is adenine, and then guanine and cytine. And those 4 letters work together to form a word. And so if you have 2 thymines, 1 guanine, and those 3, that becomes a codon, and that corresponds to an amino acid in the instruction system. It's amazing we've been able to figure this out. But the more we figure out, the more amazing it becomes. We get further and further behind. We now know enough to ask questions we couldn't even dreamed of before. It just gets more wonderful. And then, so that forms a word, you see. And then after the word, enough of those words together form a sentence, which we would call a gene. And then the gene itself forms a chromosome, ultimately. Exquisite, again. And that would be like a chapter, and the genome then would be the book. And this is not a bad analogy at all. It's language, it's information, it's complexity, and it does not produce by chance. And once again, we don't have any mutations in natural selection to work with. You cannot work with it that way at all. So the amazing thought then is that how the cellular factory then, the next level up, so you have the proteins, you have the DNA, and then the exquisite nature of the cells, the factory itself. This is such a simplistic rendering. You can't even begin to imagine. If you could expand the thing to a larger size, maybe the size of something that would be in this factory. As one writer put it, Michael Denton, he said, if you magnify it 1,000 million times until it's 12 miles in diameter, resembling a zeppelin like the famous Hindenburg, you would then see an object of unparalleled intricacy. If it was the size of the city of Atlanta, it would be more complex than Atlanta, including all the factories, all the chemical plants and so forth, water plants, and all the transportation systems. It boggles the imagination, and the more you learn, the more exquisite it becomes. So you have to have a certain amount of knowledge. As you know, the best scholars are the ones who know enough to know how little they know. So the more we're learning, the more we know how little we know, and it just keeps on going up. So every time we look into it, God bumps up the evidence. And that's with our technology. He's now displaying his glory in a way that was impossible before because we didn't know enough to see the glory of God in the way we now begin to see it. And it consists of 10 million atoms, that cell, and it all has to work together in a perfect concert. So you begin to realize it's a really high-tech factory with control systems, regulating automatic self-assembly processes, prefabrication, modular construction, It's able to reproduce itself, its entire structure within a few hours. And it's connected in about electrochemically to about 100 trillion all these other cells, and they're working together. And every chemical reaction is reversible. So this high-tech factory then, artificial languages and decoding systems, memory banks with information storage and retrieval. But if you use the computer model, you have to be careful here because it's actually a crude analogy. It's like looking at your body like we did in the 19th century, like plumbing. You see, or like then we learn about electricity and we think about electronics and so forth. Now we use the metaphor of computing. I'm telling you that's crude. A computer pales in comparison to this. It's the best analogy we can know. But you have control systems regulating automatic self-assembly, processes involving prefab and modular construction. We can't even conceive of what this is doing. It's complete replication of its own self within a few hours. It is beyond imagination. So we see every chemical reaction then, as I mentioned before, is reversible because a polypeptide bond of 4 amino acids, you can break down into 4 separates very easily. In fact, it's more likely to break down than to build up. And so what is it doing that's keeping the thing working? So it's almost unimaginable. Then, did I mention our pal, the second law? We mentioned him before when it comes to physics. Well, he works here as well because all natural processes cause a net increase in entropy, which is disorder, and a net loss of useful energy. And so any system then, left to itself, it's going to always decay. It'll always degenerate. Have you noticed this? Leave your car alone for 20 years. It's not going to develop better systems. Your desk has a boundless number of disordered states, almost infinite number of disordered states. Only a small number of things are right where they belong. Have you noticed that? Everything left to itself decays, including relationships. Anything, because we're in a world where that happens. Protein building requires pre-existing machinery. It's got to be capable of changing raw energy into highly organized forms. And life can only come from life. And complexity can only come from complexity. So the spontaneous generation of life. Remember they had the theory in the 19th century of spontaneous generation because they saw maggots on meat? So they figured they just spontaneously. Well, that's been completely disproved. Nothing appears spontaneously, and so they would like it to be so, but it doesn't work. But this is the desperate measures in which we have. So essentially, we're looking at design requiring a designer. It always does. It's been said that teleology is a lady without whom no biologist can exist. Yet he's ashamed to be seen with her in public. You see. So it's an interesting thing. They're always, notice they're using this term appealing to these wonderful movements and order and organization. And they speak about how it's designed and this is engineered to do this. You ever hear this sort of, they're using language of intentionality. They're using language of intelligence, of understanding. But they're attributing that to impersonal forces because all you have with the neo-Darwinian theory is mutations and natural selection. And mutations turn out to be deleterious in almost all instances. They don't actually make things work better. There are some cases where breaking down a thing in a mutation, although it's inferior in the cell, it actually has the accidental consequence that there are some benefits that can be achieved with that, but it doesn't last long. And so the net effect is a diminishment. So mutations aren't your friend. They are the enemy. And then to select things out, it involves some sort of intentionality. I ought to show you this video. I wish I had it set up here. Where I was just looking at another video. I love to look at videos of things. They cannot work unless they all work in concert. I think I told you about this orchid, didn't I? About it creating this pheromone, and the orchid creates a pheromone that imitates what this particular bee would be drawn to. You see, so how does it even know the pheromone to make and then replicate that? Then the next step is it draws the bee to it, and it has a special surface that's very, very smooth. And so, the bee wants to roll itself into that material, kind of little material there that gets it rolled into that, and then it suddenly becomes slippery, and it falls into a trough in the orchid. And in that trough, it's not like a pitcher plant that dissolves it. Instead, it forces the bee to have only one exit in the liquid. And under that water, there's one little hole on the side that it can go out. So it squeezes itself into that little passageway, and then the plant stops him. He holds it, and he's got his bee where he wants him. And then he deposits these 2 pods of pollen on the back of the abdomen of the bee. Once it's secured, he then releases it into the air. And then it goes to the air, so it can then go to another orchid where it will pollinate that orchid with it. You see how it works? Now work that one out. Is there a way of getting a simplistic, a sequential thing? You see where I'm going with that? There's one thing after another that I love. I just saw another thing that was amazing about these ants, these amazing ants that work together, and they're kind of weaving ants, and they make their nests in trees. And there was in a mango grove, and this tree nest, then they weave the leaves together. And so it's able to take the leaves and it puts them together to make its own nest in the tree. Now here's the amazing thing when you see the video. You can find it, I think, in BBC Earth. What it does, they all connect together there, and one's on another body, and so they form chains of bodies, you see. And then some of them are on one side, and they're all waiting in position. And then there's others on the other side, and they're waiting in their position. And then who knows what the signal is? There's no one who tells them what to do, but suddenly they know now the time is to pull their weight together and pull the leaves together. You're seeing what I'm saying here? It's an incredible thought. And then once they put them together, this is the most amazing thing. They know that the grubs at a certain point in their development have glands that actually create silk. And it turns out this silk is needful. I'll tell you why. So the ant will go down and get a grub, put it in its mouth, basically in its pincers, but doesn't crush it. Carries it up to the place where it's necessary, and then with the grub in its mouth, he shoots silk, and he goes like this back and forth, like a worker, but does it better than any of us could do it. So he shoots a silk web in there, and once it hardens, it produces a seal that holds the leaves together. Work that one out. You see, you just can't do it. It just becomes more and more marvelous. The more things I see, the more astonished I become. And all these are irreducibly small, tiny systems. They are irreducibly complex. All the places, all the components have to be together simultaneously, or it simply wouldn't work. And so you could I'm collecting really an array of these. I want to create a collection of little videos where it show people one marvel, one system after another. Every one of them defies a notion because there's no incremental way in which it would work. It's all or nothing. And that's how nature is. And so when you see this, then, we see that the crime of the age, one of the crimes of the age, is taking the credit away from the designer. You see, because what we're really doing then is, and I think this is a product really of Romans 1, and we've talked about this before. Where you have a spiritual darkness that's described in Romans 1 and verses 18 and following. So if you consider, what is this spiritual darkness? Well, there is a knowledge of God because he's wired us in such a way that we can understand it. And so in this darkness, then, the wrath of God is revealed because it says they suppress the truth. They cover it up. They push it down. They know it's true, but they do not want to acknowledge it because of the autonomy of man. So in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. He says, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what's been made. So what does it say then? They have no excuse. Remember I told you about Richard Dawkins when he was asked if you were to find out after death that there is a God, what would you say? Remember his answer? Why didn't you show me some more evidence? That arrogant statement. Then, to his horror, he'll realize when he sees the one who made all things, and every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. Because then he will realize to his horror, the evidence stared him straight in the face every day of his life. He chose not to believe it. He suppressed it. And what happens is there's a darkness, because then it says that since the creation of his world, it's all been seen, but they were with excuse. Even though they knew God, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. So there is a basic psychology of atheism that would like to get rid of God because they do not want to be accountable to him. So there's a spiritual darkness, significantly, that then produced an intellectual darkness, where they're not able to think clearly because they rejected, it's a volitional thing, a spiritual thing, which produces an intellectual darkness, and then the rest of that chapter outlines the moral depravity that's produced. And that's a great text, verses 18 to 32 of our own time. It illustrates our own time. So what you're dealing then with is that God has made the evidence manifest to us. And then we must respond to the light we've been given. We've been given so much, and I must say that I really love putting together these images of beauty in the created order. So I keep on collecting these things, because the more I see these, and just let the creation speak for itself, you begin to realize this is called gratuitous beauty. This is on the microcosm. So these are diatoms, these are pond scum, but look at the elegance that they possess. And then I look at the macrocosm. This was not available to the prophets and to the writers of the poetry of the Psalms. They didn't see this. They knew nothing, zero about the microcosm. They knew nothing about the macrocosm except for the stars that they could see with their naked eye, but they could not imagine what was beyond this. This they could be aware of. And so we see the beauties of this world and the treasures and marvels, but then once again, something they could not have known in the microcosm. So you have these extraordinary diatoms and little creatures, and then again, they had no concept of this, no concept of that. And in fact, it was only in the 20th century we began to realize that the Milky Way is not the whole universe. Only in the 20th century, in the 20s, the 1920s, that we realized ours is one galaxy among many, and this is a sister galaxy of the Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light years away. But they were aware of these things, and this beauty here, and you can see the extraordinary wonders of God. I just love his play, and just wonderful creations and marvels that we see. Again, phytoplankton, and then marvels like that. So they could be aware of that. And then you see in the world itself. So I can just keep on going around and around the patterns of nature. And it reveals a mind, it reveals a maker. And you and I are privileged then to see things that the biblical writers had no clue about. If I took the knowledge of the world that they had in the time of the writing of the scripture, that knowledge would be, let's say it's a foot wide. I would say that our knowledge now of the world, because they knew zero of the microcosm, almost nothing of the macro, and even of the midicosm, they knew almost nothing. Very, very little in comparison to what we now know. I'd say it would be miles long in one, as opposed to what we know. So more we know, the more amazed we should become. Instead, the more arrogant we become. It's an amazing thing. So God keeps on bumping up the evidence, keeps on showing, look, there's more. You can't account for this. Just keep looking, and everything is a wonder and a majesty. And so this is a radiolarium. This radiolarium looks like a stained glass window. Well, in many ways, you would be wise if you were an architect to get your cue from the natural world, diatoms. So again, we're rich with beauty and wonder and marvels that God has made on every order of magnitude. And we begin to see, how is it possible for all this to be? And we're trying to explain that away by some simplistic claim that the effect is greater than the cause. I find that to be a marvel and a wonder. Therefore, I go back to the end of my little presentation here, and I say, the end. We have a couple minutes for a question. Yes?
And if you had the opportunity to present this to a group of skeptics or hardened evolutionists, What kind of response have you gotten?
Yes, I've actually done this thing. I remember some months ago I did Science, Faith, and Reason. I did a 3-part thing for you there, Science, Faith, and Reason, and there I was looking at the evidence for from the universe's beginning, the evidence for the fine-tuning of the cosmos, the evidence for the impossibility of biogenesis, the first cell, and then fourth, the evidence for information, information-rich biomacromolecules, so that nature. And that the inference to the best explanation always points to a designing agency rather than to a chance causality. And I did this, for example, at the University of Vienna. It was kind of a funny thing. So they had the faculty and they had the students there. And we had a great Q&A session afterwards. It was quite remarkable. It forces them to see what they didn't see before. I did it at Harvard Medical School, and there were 80 Chinese graduate students who were in the sciences. And almost all of them were atheists. My friend Li Yi organized that. And these 80 MIT grads who were working there, raised as atheists by the end of that evening, and then we had a great Q&A again, because they're not aware of it. Most of them haven't got a clue. They've just bought the line. And so I found it to be stimulating. In fact, Lee told me afterwards that many of them became deists at least, and some became theists. That's not a bad night's work, you see. And a lot of, because you see, the evidence does show. It's just they haven't heard it before. They haven't heard a coherent. So I'm not trying to prove too much. I'm not trying to prove or push six-stage creationism. They're always associated with certain stereotypes. So I think if you, in a fair hearing, you can do this. I've done this at Oxford as well. And so I think if people are willing to hear another point of view, and that's a requirement, though, of a sort of what I call epistemic humility, that you have to be humble enough to be willing to learn and be corrected and hear two sides of an argument, to have charity, to have curiosity, to have the humility to hear. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to hear another point of view. So I'm afraid we're out of time. But we're going to move on to new topics next time around. Let me just close in prayer. Father, we thank you that you have loved us with an everlasting love, that you're the one who holds the cosmos together, that Jesus, in fact, is the one, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And you are the one who upholds all things by the word of your power, and you sustain all things. And you, the Logos, who does this, has become one of us, the God-man, so that you and us and we and you, we now have an intimate relationship with the author of all things, who is both terrifying and infinite, but also intimate. We pray that we would, in fact, leverage this new knowledge that we see in the world around us for your glory, for your honor in these last days. And that we realize that the days are short, and yet you are so increasing the evidence of your presence in preparation, ultimately, for our seeing you face to face. And then we will behold that face we've longed to see all of our lives, the wellspring of all beauty, the wellspring of all goodness, and of all truth. We pray in your name. Amen.